This is the Countess Wore Arsenic, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Welcome back to the Little Grey Cells. I am Arthur Hastings, your faithful companion on yet another expedition into the shadowed corners of human nature. Allow me to express our deepest gratitude to our devoted listeners across the globe. If this is your maiden voyage with us, do consider subscribing and leaving a comment telling us from which corner of the world you listen. Lower your lights, pour yourself a calming tisane in the manner of Poirot himself, and ready those little grey cells of yours. Chapter 1. The House That Watched. "You will adore her," said Lady Margaret Horbury, in the tone of a woman who had never in her life supposed anyone could resist her recommendations. "She is quite the most extraordinary creature in England, possibly in Europe." Hercule Poirot said nothing. He was occupied at that moment in observing the gravel drive that curved toward the portico of Blackthorn House, and in noting, with a faint displeasure, that the topiary on the left-hand side had been allowed to grow some 2 inches beyond the topiary on the right. Such things mattered. They were, Poirot had long maintained, indicative of a mind insufficiently attentive to order. The car turned and the house came fully into view. It was Georgian in structure, long and pale-stoned, with tall, narrow windows that caught the failing afternoon light and gave nothing back. Ivy had crept along the eastern wing until it darkened the stone like a slow stain. The portico was handsome enough, supported by columns weathered to the colour of old bone. The rose gardens on either side had gone largely to seed, skeletal stems and a few last petals, copper-brown and shivering in the October wind. Poirot observed all of this with the expression of a man who has been promised a pleasant afternoon and suspects he has been deceived. "Extraordinary," he murmured, though not of the Countess. Lady Margaret, seated beside him with a fur stole and an expression of cheerful certainty, patted his gloved hand. She was a comfortable woman of 55, with pink cheeks and the kind of sociable warmth that fills rooms without quite illuminating them. She had known Poirot for some years, in the pleasant, undemanding fashion of English acquaintance, and she had extended this weekend invitation with a persistence that had eventually worn through even his considerable resistance to country houses. "You will see," she said. "Eleanor is unlike anyone." Poirot did not doubt it. He doubted, rather, whether unlike was an attribute he currently required in his life. The hall of Blackthorn House smelled of furniture polish, old wood, and something else beneath both of these. Something faintly medicinal, like herbs dried too long in a dark cupboard. A tall footman in rather antiquated livery took their coats. The interior carried the particular atmosphere of a house that had been grand and knew it, and was waiting with aristocratic patience to be grand again. Ancestral portraits lined the staircase, not English faces, Poirot noticed, but Slavic ones, heavy-browed, melancholy, with the eyes of people accustomed to winters of unusual severity. Velvet curtains in deep crimson framed the landing windows. A long case clock ticked with immense solemnity in the corner of the hall, as though measuring something other than the hours. In the drawing-room, a fire burned vigorously, and yet the room was not quite warm. Poirot paused on the threshold. On the mantelpiece stood a pair of porcelain dogs, Staffordshire by their look, and quite charming in their way, placed at slightly different angles to one another. The left faced forward at precisely 90 degrees. The right had drifted perhaps 15 degrees toward the window. It was a small asymmetry. It was also, to Poirot's mind, intolerable. He crossed the room, adjusted the right-hand dog, stepped back, and assessed the result. "Ah," he said softly, civilization restored. "Monsieur Poirot has very particular standards." The voice came from beside the fireplace, and Poirot turned. Countess Elena Vorenska had not been present when he entered the room. He was certain of it, and yet here she stood, as though she had materialized from the firelight itself. A tall woman of perhaps 58, silver blonde, dressed in dark silk with a double rope of garnets at her throat. Her face was fine-boned and striking rather than beautiful. The eyes a pale, glassy grey beneath heavy lids. She wore her age as some women wear expensive jewellery. With the confidence of knowing its value, she smiled. It was a charming smile, Poirot acknowledged. Perfectly charming. "Countess," he inclined his head with continental correctness. "You must forgive the liberty. I have a small weakness for symmetry." "On the contrary." Her English was precise, faintly accented, each word placed with deliberate care. "I find it most reassuring. A man who cannot bear disorder. Such a man one can trust to see clearly." Her gaze held his for a moment longer than convention strictly required. Then she turned with the ease of a woman who has never in her life needed to hurry, and greeted Lady Margaret with a warmth that appeared entirely genuine. The other guests had gathered by degrees, with the shuffling, self-conscious air of people who are not quite certain how they come to be in the same room. Dr. Adrian Locke was the first Poirot could identify with confidence. A lean man of 40, with the still, watchful quality of someone trained to observe symptoms. He shook hands with a firm economy of movement, said very little, and positioned himself near the window with a glass of sherry he did not appear to drink. When the Countess spoke, Poirot noticed Dr. Locke's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the stem of the glass. Nicholas Trent arrived late, full of easy apologies and the kind of good-natured energy that tends, in Poirot's experience, to conceal anxiety. He was young, 30 or perhaps a little more, fair-haired and well-dressed, with the broad smile and quick eyes of a man in the business of making favourable impressions. He had come, he explained to anyone who would listen, to assess the Countess's collection of drawings. He used the word assessment with rather too much enthusiasm for a man who found the work routine. Anna Petrovna occupied a chair near the door in the manner of someone who expects, at any moment, to be asked to leave it. She was a small, pale woman in her 40s, dressed in grey, with hands that were never quite still in her lap. She was introduced as the Countess's companion of many years, and she received the introduction in silence, as though it were not information that required acknowledgement. Her eyes, Poirot noted, moved constantly, not with the darting agitation of nerves, but with the slow, systematic sweep of someone conducting a private inventory. Edward Horbury was Lady Margaret's nephew, recently returned from abroad, a gentle-looking young man with the slight diffidence of someone still relearning the rhythms of peacetime. He was kind-faced and quiet, dressed without vanity, and he spoke to each person with the particular attentiveness of someone who has spent too long without conversation. He did not speak to the Countess at all, and the Countess, Poirot observed, did not speak to him. Dinner was served at 8. The dining room was handsome by candlelight, its long table set with silver that had been polished to a ferocious brightness. The food was excellent, a clear consomme, a roast of considerable accomplishment, a pudding that Lady Margaret praised with uncontained delight. The conversation moved across the surface of things, the weather, the difficulty of finding good servants, the reopening of a particular gallery in London. Poirot ate with appreciation and observed with rather more. It was during the fish course that the footman appeared at the Countess's elbow. He was young, and his hands, as he presented the letter on its small silver tray, were not entirely steady. The Countess took the envelope without glancing at it, finished her sentence to Lady Margaret regarding the merits of a particular spa in Switzerland, and then opened the letter with a silver knife. She read it. The table continued its conversation. Only Poirot was watching, not the Countess precisely, but the space around her, the quality of stillness that descended over her like a held breath. For a moment, 3 seconds, perhaps 4, her face became quite white. The pale eyes went flat and still as frozen water. Then she folded the letter. Then she smiled. "Forgive me," she said lightly, to no one and everyone. "Old ghosts have long memories." She set the folded letter beside her plate and lifted her wineglass, and the table's conversation resumed around her, as though nothing had occurred. Poirot said nothing. He ate a small quantity of fish. He thought about the steadiness of the Countess's hand as she raised her glass, and about the 3 or 4 seconds during which that hand had not been steady at all. Later, he could not have said precisely what caused him to pause in the long corridor that connected the east wing to the main staircase. He had been proceeding to his room, a pleasant enough room, though the draught beneath the door was unacceptable, when he heard, from somewhere ahead, the sound of voices speaking in a register just below ordinary conversation. He stopped. He had not survived a considerable career in the detection of crime by failing to stop when something in his mind said, "Stop." The voices were the Countess's and Dr. Locke's. He could not make out Locke's words. They were low, urgent, a kind of murmur that conveyed anxiety without content. But the Countess's voice, though held deliberately quiet, had the carrying quality of a woman accustomed to being heard. "If they think to frighten me now," she said, "they forget who I am." A pause. Then a door softly closed. Poirot stood in the corridor for a moment, listening to the long case clock in the hall below, counting out its slow and solemn measure. He thought, a letter that produces 4 seconds of unguarded fear in a woman of that composure is not a letter about old ghosts. He thought, a physician who stands in dark corridors receiving whispered instructions from his patroness does not behave as a physician ought. He thought, as he continued toward his room and the unacceptable draught, something in this house has already begun. He could not yet say what, but the little grey cells had been roused from their comfortable torpor, and they would, he knew from long experience, give him no peace until the matter was resolved. Blackthorn House settled around him, ticking and breathing in the dark. Outside, the wind moved through the dead roses without mercy. Chapter 2. The tension beneath Poirot slept badly. This was not in itself unusual in a country house. Country houses, in his experience, reliably produced draughts, eccentric plumbing, and mattresses of a firmness that suggested the English regarded physical comfort with moral suspicion. Blackthorn House offered all 3, but it was not the mattress that kept him wakeful until past 2 o'clock, nor the wind that pressed against the window with the persistence of something that wished to be let in. It was the letter, not its contents, which he had not seen. Rather its effect, those 3 or 4 seconds of naked alarm on the face of a woman who had, by all appearances, long since ceased to be alarmed by anything the world might produce. Fear of that quality is not easily acquired. It is the residue of something genuinely dangerous, something with teeth. He rose at 7, dressed with his customary precision, and went down to breakfast. The dining room in the early morning had an entirely different character from its candlelit self of the previous evening. Daylight filtering through tall windows onto the remains of a sideboard laid with kedgeree, toast, and cold meats revealed the room's shabbiness with the candour of an old friend. The silver, so impressive by night, showed tarnish at the edges. The curtain closest to the fireplace had been mended, carefully but not invisibly, along its lower hem. Nicholas Trent was already at table, eating with appetite and reading a folded newspaper with the concentrated attention of a man who is, in fact, thinking of something else entirely. He looked up when Poirot entered, and his smile came a half-second after it should have done. "Monsieur Poirot, you're an early riser." "I find the morning hours most productive for thought," Poirot said pleasantly, and helped himself to a modest quantity of kedgeree. "You also could not sleep." "Oh, I slept perfectly." Trent returned to his newspaper with a speed that confirmed he had not. Poirot ate in a companionable silence that he found entirely satisfying, and suspected Trent found rather less so. Presently the young man set down his newspaper, refilled his coffee cup, and said, with the careful ease of someone who has rehearsed the question, "Extraordinary woman, the Countess, isn't she? Have you known her long?" "We met for the first time yesterday evening." "Ah," a pause. "She has a remarkable collection, you know. The drawings alone, there are 3 I've attributed to the Venetian school, mid-18th century, quite exceptional. One wonders how she came by them, after everything." He let this observation hang in the air for a moment, before adding, "The Revolution, I mean. Most of her kind lost everything." "Most," Poirot agreed in a tone that offered nothing further. Trent looked at him. Then he looked away. Then he folded his newspaper with a great deal more care than the task required, and excused himself. Poirot finished his kedgeree and considered what he had just been told, and what he had not. The morning unfolded with the particular listlessness of a country weekend in late autumn, when the garden offers nothing and the house offers too much proximity. Lady Margaret attempted to organise a walk on the downs. The wind defeated her. Dr. Locke retreated to what the footman called the small library, and remained there. Edward Horbury sat in the morning room with a book that he did not appear to read, staring occasionally at the garden with the expression of a man conducting a private argument. Anna Petrovna moved through the house like a ghost in grey wool. Poirot watched her with interest. She had, he had noted at dinner, a capacity for stillness that most people mistake for vacancy. Poirot did not make this mistake. He had observed over the course of the previous evening that she positioned herself consistently near doors and at angles that gave her clear sightlines across rooms. The habit, he thought, of someone who has spent a great deal of time ensuring they would not be surprised. He found her in the long gallery that ran along the back of the house, ostensibly occupied with a piece of embroidery. The gallery smelled of cold stone and old linen, and its windows looked out over what had once been a formal parterre, now given largely to weeds and brown grass. The garden must have been very fine, Poirot observed, pausing beside her. Some years ago. Anna Petrovna glanced up at him. Her needlework did not pause. "The Countess has little interest in gardens," she said. Her English was good, accented differently from her employers, flatter, more northern. "But you have been with her a long time. 20 years, Lady Margaret tells me." 19. A considerable loyalty. He let the word loyalty sit between them without pressing it. Anna Petrovna set one precise stitch, and then another. "The Countess requires someone who understands her requirements," she said at last. "I understand them." "Completely." The needlework stopped. She looked at him directly for the first time, and Poirot saw, behind the pale composure, something that was not quite hostility and not quite fear, but resided in the neighbourhood of both. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "you are a detective." "Retired," he said pleasantly. "Naturellement," she said, the single French word dropped in with a precision that struck him as entirely deliberate, and returned to her embroidery. It was at luncheon that Poirot first had the opportunity to study the Countess in the full society of her guests, and by daylight. She was, he concluded, a virtuoso of social performance. She drew conversation from Edward Horbury by the simple means of not directing any towards him, so that he felt, gradually, the discomfort of silence and began to fill it. She managed Dr. Locke with small, precise requests. "Pass the salt, thank you, Adrian," that were not requests at all, but demonstrations of a relationship's established geography. She charmed Trent with an offhand mention of a canaletto she was uncertain about, and watched with the faintest curl of satisfaction as his professional interest overcame his studied nonchalance. Lady Margaret she appeared to genuinely like, which Poirot found the most interesting thing about her. He had been placed at the Countess's left at table, and at one point she turned to him with that direct, assessing gaze and said, "You are very quiet, Monsieur Poirot. A quiet man sees a great deal." "One hopes so," he said, "though what one sees is not always what one expects." "And what do you expect in a house like this?" "I expect," Poirot said with complete truthfulness, "nothing in particular, which is in my experience precisely when the interesting things occur." She studied him for a moment. Her expression was unreadable in the way that only very intelligent faces become unreadable, not blank, but layered, so that each interpretation suggested another beneath it. "You have been warned about me," she said. Not an accusation, rather a statement of arithmetic, like the sum of two known quantities. "I have been told you are extraordinary," Poirot said, "by Lady Margaret, who I believe to be a woman incapable of malice." "Incapable of malice," the Countess repeated, as though tasting the phrase. "What a very limiting quality." And she turned smoothly to Trent and began to speak about the canaletto. After luncheon, the afternoon arranged itself with leaden inevitability. Lady Margaret found a jigsaw puzzle of enormous ambition and installed it on a table in the sitting room, issuing invitations to assist that no one quite refused and no one quite accepted. Dr. Locke disappeared again. Trent was taken by the Countess to the long drawing-room where the paintings were hung, and their voices, his enthusiastic, hers considered, drifted at intervals into the corridor. Poirot accepted a cup of tisane from a maid who brought it without being asked, which told him that the Countess had given instructions about his preferences. He stood at the window of the sitting room and watched Edward Horbury, who had gone out onto the terrace despite the cold, and stood there with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at nothing. Lady Margaret appeared at Poirot's elbow with a corner piece of jigsaw. "Poor Edward," she said quietly. "He has not been himself since he arrived. I thought a country weekend might do him good, but I begin to wonder whether I was quite right to bring him here. He is acquainted with the Countess? Lady Margaret hesitated. The hesitation was brief but genuine, the pause of a woman deciding in real time how much to say. His father was, she said at last, many years ago. He worked for her in some capacity during her time on the continent. He died rather suddenly, I believe. Edward was very young. She looked at the jigsaw piece in her hand. He has never spoken of it, not to me, but one notices things. One does, Poirot agreed inwardly. One most certainly does. He looked again at the young man on the terrace. Edward Horbury had turned toward the house, and for a moment, through the glass, his gaze met Poirot's. There was nothing challenging in the look. There was, in fact, something almost relieved about it. The expression of a man who has been carrying a weight alone and finds, unexpectedly, that someone else has noticed. Then Edward turned away and walked to the far end of the terrace and stood, looking out at the cold sea. Poirot set down his tisane. Something in this house, he thought again, has already begun. And it had begun, he was increasingly certain, not with the letter delivered at dinner, but considerably earlier than that. The only question was whether it had yet reached its conclusion. By tea-time, he suspected it had not. By the following morning, he knew he had been wrong. Chapter 3. The Serene Face. The maid's scream reached Poirot while he was knotting his second shoe. It was not the prolonged, theatrical kind of scream that features in sensation novels. It was short, bitten off almost immediately, which made it considerably worse. That particular sound, the scream that stops itself, belongs to someone who has seen something so outside the ordinary catalogue of experience that the voice simply ceases to function. Poirot had heard it before. He knew precisely what it presaged. He was in the East Corridor within 40 seconds, which was, given his age and the distance involved, a creditable achievement. The door to the Countess's private sitting room stood open. The maid, a young woman of perhaps 20, her face the colour of uncooked pastry, stood pressed against the wall beside it, one hand at her mouth. She was beyond speech. Poirot patted her arm once, briefly, and went in. The room was small and very still. A fire had burned down to grey ash in the grate. Morning light came through half-drawn curtains, pale and without warmth, and fell across the chair nearest. The fireplace where the Countess sat with the composed, upright quality of a woman who has simply declined to move. Her dark silk gown was perfectly arranged. Her hands rested in her lap. Her face, turned slightly toward the window, wore an expression of faint abstraction, as though she had been interrupted mid-thought and had not quite returned from it. She would not return from it. On the small table at her right hand stood a coffee cup, a cream jug of Sèvres porcelain, and a silver sugar bowl. The coffee in the cup was cold. The cream had formed a skin. Poirot stood in the doorway for a moment without entering further. He looked at the room as a whole. Its arrangement, what was present, what was absent, the quality of the disorder that was, in this case, the absence of any disorder at all. Then he stepped carefully inside. He did not touch anything. He looked. The garnets she had worn at dinner were still at her throat. Her silver blonde hair was dressed, though not with its usual formality. The hair of a woman who had prepared for sleep, and then, for some reason, had not slept. One small detail caught his eye and held it. On the table's edge, just beyond the coffee tray, lay a folded square of white linen, as though placed there with deliberate tidiness. A handkerchief. Poirot bent over it without touching. Quite clean, quite dry, but folded with a precision that struck him as odd. Not the casual folding of someone who had simply set it down, but the neat, considered arrangement of someone performing an action for the last time and wishing to leave things in order. He straightened and went to find Dr. Locke. Locke was at the breakfast table, alone with a cup of coffee and the expression of a man who has not tasted what he is drinking. When Poirot appeared in the doorway, something passed across Locke's face. A rapid, internal adjustment, like a shutter drawn and reopened, before he said quite steadily, "What is it?" "The Countess," Poirot said. "I am afraid you are required." Nothing in Locke's manner was excessive. He rose, set down his cup, and followed Poirot back along the corridor with the measured calm of a man who has delivered bad news, often enough to have developed a professional buffer against receiving it. It was, Poirot reflected, either the composure of a good physician or of someone who was not, in fact, surprised. The examination was thorough and did not take long. Locke crouched beside the chair, checked the pulse at the wrist and the throat with careful fingers, examined the lips, the fingertips, the whites of the eyes. He lifted each eyelid with the impersonal gentleness of long practice. Then he stood and was silent for rather longer than the situation strictly required. "Well," Poirot said quietly, "she has been dead some hours." Locke's voice was controlled but thin at the edges, like ice that has not quite decided whether to hold. "Since the early hours of the morning, I should estimate. Midnight, or not long after." He paused. "The presentation is consistent with arsenical poisoning. The skin coloration, the—" He stopped. "I will need to confirm, naturally, but I have seen it before, in the literature." "In the literature," Poirot repeated. Locke met his eye. "And once, clinically, many years ago." "You will telephone for the police," Poirot said. It was not a question. "Of course. And you will tell the other guests nothing further until they arrive. I would be grateful if you would say only that the Countess has been taken ill. The precise circumstances can be established by those whose business they are." Locke looked at him for a moment. "You are not merely a retired detective, Monsieur Poirot," he said without any particular inflection. "Non," Poirot agreed pleasantly. "I am not merely anything." The guests gathered in the drawing-room with the subdued, uncertain air of people summoned to receive news they already half suspect. Lady Margaret arrived first, wearing the expression she reserved for situations that had exceeded her considerable optimism about the world. She took one look at Poirot's face and sat down in the nearest chair without speaking, which was, from Lady Margaret, eloquent. Nicholas Trent came in from the direction of the picture gallery with a heightened colour and an alertness in his eyes that might have been concern and might have been something else entirely. He asked 3 questions in quick succession. What had happened? Was it serious? Had anyone called anyone? And received sufficiently uninformative answers to each that he eventually stopped asking and took up a position near the window, where he stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked out at the grey morning. Anna Petrovna arrived last and said nothing at all. She chose a straight-backed chair near the door and sat with her hands folded, and her face had the quality of a room from which all the furniture has been removed, emptied, and the emptiness somehow worse than whatever had been there before. Edward Horbury came down from upstairs with a tie that had been knotted in some haste, and the slightly dazed look of a man who has dressed rapidly in response to sounds he could not account for. He stood in the doorway, read the room in a single sweep of the eyes, and went pale. "She is dead," he said. Not a question, a recognition. "Edward," Lady Margaret said sharply. "She is," Poirot said quietly. "I'm sorry to confirm it. The police have been sent for. Until they arrive, I ask that no one leave the house, and that nothing in the Countess's sitting room be touched or disturbed." The silence that followed had several distinct textures. Lady Margaret's was grief, the genuine variety, imperfect and immediate. Trent's contained something jagged, unease or calculation, or both simultaneously. Locke stood at the fireplace with his arms folded and looked at nothing. Anna Petrovna's hands had stilled in her lap. Edward Horbury looked at the floor. His face had moved through pale to something more complicated, relief and distress occupying the same expression with the awkward cohabitation of emotions that have no business sharing quarters. Poirot observed all of it. He observed, too, what no one did. No one asked how she had died. It was Lady Margaret who first broke the silence with speech rather than atmosphere. "But who would—" she began, and then stopped herself, as though the sentence had arrived at a conclusion she was not prepared to voice. "That," Poirot said, "is precisely the question." He excused himself while the others were still settling into the new reality of their morning, and went back to the sitting room, alone. He stood at the centre of the room and turned slowly, taking inventory. The coffee service, the sugar bowl, its lid in place, the silver spoon resting across its rim at a slight angle. The Sèvres cream jug. A small plate that had held, by the few remaining crumbs, a sweet biscuit of some kind. The dead fire. The window latched from within. The door he had entered, which had been the only door. He looked at the cigarette case. It lay on the small table, half obscured by the shadow of the coffee tray. A slim, silver case, slightly old-fashioned in its engraving, the kind that had been fashionable before the war. He had noticed it when he first entered the room, registered it as incongruous, and then been drawn away by other things. Now he returned to it. The Countess, in 2 days of close observation, had not once smoked. He bent down. The case was not quite closed. The clasp had caught on one side only, so that the lid stood open a hair's breadth. Through the gap he could see, quite clearly, a fine trace of white powder along the interior lining. It was not the residue of tobacco. It was too fine, too even, too deliberate in its distribution. Poirot straightened. He did not touch the case. He stood very still for a moment, in the manner of a man who has just heard a piece of music resolve unexpectedly into a different key. Not wrongly, but differently in a way that reframes everything that came before. "Mais oui," he said very quietly to the empty room. Then, more quietly still, "Poison, yes, but whose poison, and for whom?" Outside in the corridor, feet moved. Voices conferred. The machinery of catastrophe, once set in motion, performs its functions with great efficiency. Poirot left the room without touching anything, pulled the door closed behind him, and went to stand at the end of the corridor where a window looked out over the dead garden. The silver cigarette case that belonged to no one. The white powder that was not tobacco. And a woman who had received a frightening letter and spoken of people who wished to frighten her, and was now sitting upright in a velvet chair with the composed expression of a woman who had not, in the end been frightened at all. He thought, this is not the beginning of the story. It is the middle. And somewhere in this house, he thought further, someone knows how the story started. Chapter 4. The impossible coffee inspector Graves arrived from Lewes at 11:30 with a sergeant, a doctor from the county constabulary, and the air of a man who had been promised a straightforward poisoning and was already beginning to suspect he had been misled. He was a solid, sandy-haired man of 45, built for endurance rather than speed, with the patient, slightly mournful expression of someone who has spent 2 decades listening to accounts of what people claim they did not do. He shook Poirot's hand with the careful neutrality of a man who has heard of Hercule Poirot and is reserving judgment. Monsieur Poirot. A pause waited with professional assessment. You were a guest in the house. I am. And you've been in the sitting room? Twice. On both occasions I was careful to disturb nothing. Poirot tilted his head. There is an object on the table beside. The body that you will wish to examine with some attention. A silver cigarette case, partially open. The interior contains a white powder. Graves regarded him for a moment. You notice this. I notice most things, Inspector. It is, you might say, a professional habit that retirement has not succeeded in extinguishing. Something shifted in Graves's expression. Not warmth precisely, but the particular adjustment of a man who has decided to be cautiously cooperative rather than merely polite. I'd be glad, he said, of anything you can tell me. Bon. Then let us begin with what I know, proceed to what I suspect, and arrive, in due course, at what neither of us yet understands. The county doctor's examination confirmed what Locke had concluded. Arsenical poisoning, administered some hours before dawn. The precise means and the precise quantity would require laboratory analysis. What the examination established immediately, and what interested Poirot considerably, was the question of the coffee. The cup contained cold coffee with a trace of arsenic in the residue at the bottom, and yet the arsenic had not killed her there. The county doctor was a brisk, compact man named Fellows, who spoke in the manner of someone submitting a report rather than conducting a conversation. He explained to Graves, with Poirot attentively present, that the quantity of arsenic present in the coffee residue was insufficient to have proved fatal. It was consistent with a small dose. Enough to cause discomfort, perhaps, but not death. Death had required considerably more. Then the coffee was not the primary vehicle, Graves said. Not for the fatal dose, no. But there was arsenic in it. A quantity, yes. Graves looked at Poirot, who was looking at the sugar bowl with an expression of profound and private interest. The guests were interviewed in the morning room, one at a time, beginning at noon. Graves conducted the interviews with Poirot present, a concession that had required a short, tactful conversation and the invocation of certain names in the Sussex constabulary who thought well of Poirot's methods. Graves listened to these names and agreed with the resigned pragmatism of a man who has learned when to be flexible. Lady Margaret was interviewed first and was heroically unhelpful in the manner unique to genuinely well-intentioned witnesses. She had heard nothing unusual in the night. She could not conceive of anyone wishing harm to the Countess, though she acknowledged under gentle pressure that she had privately entertained 1 or 2 reservations about certain aspects of Elena's past. She could not specify these reservations. They were more of a feeling, really. She was sorry she could not be more precise. She thought Dr. Locke a thoroughly reliable man. She was less certain about Mr. Trent, though she could not have said why. She liked Anna Petrovna very much in a general way, without feeling she knew her at all. When she had gone, Graves said, "Not much there." "On the contrary," Poirot said, "Lady Margaret has told us a great deal. She simply does not know it." Nicholas Trent presented himself with an ease that was almost too well managed, the ease of someone who has had some hours to compose himself and has used them methodically. He had spent the evening before, he said, looking over the Countess's drawings in the long gallery until approximately 10 o'clock. He had then retired to his room. He had taken a sleeping draught. He produced the bottle from his coat pocket with a promptness that struck Poirot as slightly rehearsed, and had heard nothing further until the disturbance of the morning. "The sleeping draught," Poirot said before Graves could move on. "You travel with it habitually?" Trent looked at him. "I've had difficulty sleeping for some months. It's entirely prescribed." "But, of course," Poirot smiled in a manner that conveyed absolutely nothing. "I ask only because a man who takes a sleeping draught cannot be a witness to the night's events, which is either very convenient or very unfortunate, depending on one's perspective." Trent's jaw tightened fractionally. "I'm afraid I can't arrange my insomnia to suit an investigation." "No," Poirot agreed warmly. "No, that would be most unreasonable." After Trent had gone, Graves made a note. Poirot did not. He had no need of notes for the things that mattered. He was thinking about debt, the particular species of anxiety it produces, the calculations it drives a man toward, the way it tends to concentrate the mind upon objects of value in the rooms one moves through. Anna Petrovna arrived and sat with her hands folded and answered every question with the minimal precision of someone who has decided in advance exactly how much ground to cede. She had prepared the Countess's coffee the previous evening, as she did every evening. She had left it on the tray in the sitting room at 9:30. The Countess had been alive and well at that time. Composed even, Anna said, almost tranquil. She had not spoken of the letter again. "The cigarette case," Poirot said. "Have you seen it before?" A pause, so brief it was almost not a pause. "I have seen the Countess with a cigarette case, yes." "This particular case? Silver, engraved with a floral pattern along the lid?" "I could not say with certainty. She had several." "She smoked, then?" Another pause, longer this time, and this one Anna Petrovna could not have prevented. "Occasionally," she said. "In private?" Poirot nodded pleasantly and said nothing further on the subject, which appeared to unsettle Anna Petrovna considerably more than further questions would have done. Dr. Locke was last. He came in with the controlled, upright bearing of a man who knows he is in an unfavourable position and has decided that dignity is his best remaining asset. He sat, folded his hands on the table before him, and waited. Graves took him through the practicalities, his role, his tenure with the Countess, his medical qualifications, his knowledge of toxicology. Locke answered each question with the precision of a man reciting from a prepared text. Accurate, no doubt, but smoothed of spontaneity. "You examined the body," Graves said, "before I arrived." "Monsieur Poirot asked me to. As a physician, it was the natural response." "And you've had professional experience with arsenic poisoning. You said as much to Monsieur Poirot this morning." "In the literature, and once clinically. I don't believe I concealed either fact." "No," Graves said. "You were quite forthcoming about it." He let that sit for a moment. "Your financial arrangement with the Countess. She was your primary source of income." Locke's composure flickered. She retained my services, yes. And if those services were no longer required? A silence. I would have found other patients. Quite so. Graves made a note. Poirot examined his own fingernails. When Locke had gone, Graves said, he had the knowledge and the access. And if she was planning to dismiss him, the facts say yes, Poirot said, almost to himself. He was gazing at the middle distance with the focused inwardness of a man conducting a rapid private argument. The facts arranged themselves around Dr. Locke with considerable enthusiasm. The knowledge, the access, the motive, all present, all documented, all conveniently available. You don't sound convinced. I am convinced of the facts. It is the psychology that gives me pause. Poirot turned. Dr. Locke is an intelligent man who commits a murder in a house full of witnesses, using a poison that falls precisely within his documented area of expertise, having recently been identified as a likely financial casualty of his victim. That is not intelligence, Inspector. That is an invitation. Graves considered this with the expression of a man who finds it inconvenient but cannot dismiss it. Then who? That, Poirot said, rising from his chair with the contained energy of a man who has just identified the direction in which the problem lies, is what we must establish. But first, the interview that has not yet taken place. Horbury, yes, I was coming to him. Edward Horbury, Poirot said quietly, knew this house. Or rather, he knew something of the woman who lived in it, something that brought him here under the cover of a casual weekend visit, something that has been sitting behind his eyes since the moment he arrived. He paused at the door. I think, Inspector, that before you interview him, it would be wise to allow me a brief conversation first. There are things a man will say to another man. Not a policeman, not an authority, simply another man who has perhaps seen something of the world's less tidy arrangements, that he will not say in a formal setting. Graves looked at him for a long moment. "Half an hour," he said. "That," said Poirot, "will be quite sufficient." Chapter 5. What Edward knew. Edward Horbury was in the library. He had chosen, Poirot noted, the chair farthest from the door, not the defensive position of a guilty man seeking an exit, but the instinctive retreat of someone who wished not to be come upon suddenly. He was sitting with a book open in his lap that he was plainly not reading, and when Poirot entered he looked up with the expression of a man who has been expecting a particular visitor and is simultaneously relieved and apprehensive at his arrival. The library was a better room than most of Blackthorn House. Warmer, its shelves densely packed with volumes that had actually been read, their spines cracked and faded in the uneven way of books that have been pulled down, consulted, and returned without ceremony. A small fire burned competently. Rain had begun against the windows sometime in the last hour, and the sound of it gave the room an enclosed, confidential quality that Poirot did not find unwelcome. He settled into the chair opposite Edward without preamble and said, "Tell me about your father." Edward looked at him. Then he closed the book and set it aside with the careful movement of someone buying himself a moment. "My aunt told you. Lady Margaret mentioned that your father worked for the Countess, that he died suddenly, that you were very young at the time." Poirot paused. "She did not tell me why you came to Blackthorn House. I think perhaps you can." The rain moved across the window in a gust. Edward Horbury looked at the fire for a long moment, not evasively, but with the collecting expression of someone assembling, from many separate pieces gathered over many years, a coherent account. My father was Robert Horbury, he said at last. He served in the diplomatic service before the war. The First War, I mean. In the early 20s, he was attached to a private capacity, working for various continental clients who needed discreet assistance moving assets out of Europe. Documents, valuables, money. The usual business of that period. A brief, bleak compression of the mouth. Elena Varenska was one of those clients. He helped her leave Russia in 1920, helped her establish herself in Paris and then in London. He was good at that sort of work, thorough and reliable. And the Countess valued reliability. She valued it until it became inconvenient. Edward's voice had not risen. If anything, it had dropped, which made it more difficult to listen to. My father knew things about her, how she had come by certain items she brought out of Russia, who had helped her, and who had subsequently disappeared. There were 3 men that I know of who assisted her escape and who were dead within 5 years. 2 of them had families who might have asked questions. None of them did, because by the time anyone thought to ask, the Countess was a wealthy and well-connected woman in London, and the men were merely unfortunate casualties of a turbulent period. Poirot said nothing. He had learned over a long career that the most productive thing a listener can sometimes do is to remain entirely still. My father died in 1931, Edward continued. He had been corresponding with the Countess about certain, he called them discrepancies, inconsistencies in the accounts from the Paris period. I was 12. I did not understand at the time what any of it meant. My mother was told it was his heart. He looked up. He was 41 years old and had no history of heart trouble whatsoever. You believe the Countess killed him? I believe it with considerable conviction, Monsieur Poirot. But conviction is not proof, and I have spent the better part of 15 years understanding the difference. The ghost of something that was not quite bitterness and not quite resolve crossed his face. I came here because I had been told by a man I trust who moves in certain circles that the Countess kept records, personal records going back to the Russian period, letters, ledgers, a private journal, that they were kept somewhere in this house. I hope to find them. And instead you found Hercule Poirot. A faint, exhausted movement at the corners of his mouth that almost achieved a smile. And instead I found you. He straightened. I have not touched anything in her rooms. I want you to know that. Whatever I came here to do, I did not do it. And now she is dead, and I find that I don't quite know what to feel, which is its own sort of punishment, I suppose. Poirot studied him. The set of the shoulders, the steadiness of the gaze, the particular quality of distress that sits differently on a guilty man than an innocent one. Guilt tends to produce a watchful, outward-facing anxiety, the eyes that track the room. What Edward Horbury displayed was interior, self-directed, the suffering of someone whose long-rehearsed purpose has been abruptly rendered purposeless. "Last night," Poirot said, "after dinner, did you leave your room?" "No." "You are certain?" "I am." A pause. "I considered it. I lay awake for 2 hours considering it. In the end, I did not go. I told myself it was because I lacked the nerve. I think now it may have been something else." He looked at Poirot directly. "I think I had decided somewhere during those 2 hours that it was no longer what I wanted. Proof, vengeance, whatever I had called it to myself, I think I had finally tired of it. She was an old woman, and whatever she had been, I was not my father. The rain against the glass, the fire settling. Poirot rose. "You've been very frank with me, Mr. Horbury. I imagine being less than frank with you would be a fairly futile exercise." "Oui," Poirot agreed with complete sincerity. "It would." He moved toward the door, then paused. "These records you believe the Countess kept, the journal, the letters from the Russian period, you have no idea where they might be housed within the house. Her private sitting room, most likely, or a study if she had one. She was a meticulous woman." A brief hesitation. "She would not have destroyed them. People like Elena Varenska do not destroy records. They keep them because they represent leverage, even leverage over the dead." Poirot nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, half to himself. "That is consistent with what I know of her." He found Anna Petrovna in the corridor outside, which was not entirely surprising. She was carrying a small tray with a cup of tea on it that no one appeared to have requested, moving with the unhurried purpose of a woman performing a task that happens to require her to be in a particular place at a particular time. She stopped when she saw Poirot emerge from the library, and the cup rattled very faintly in its saucer. "For Mr. Horbury," she said. "I thought he might want something warm." "Very considerate," Poirot said. He did not move from the centre of the corridor. "Tell me, Mademoiselle Petrovna, how did you come to be in the Countess's employ?" She looked at him with those steady, inventorying eyes. "She required a companion. I required a position. It was mutually convenient." "In what year?" 1927. "And before that, you were in London already, or did you come from the continent?" Something tightened almost imperceptibly around her eyes. "From Paris. I had been working there for a Russian family, a family that had, by 1927, largely dispersed. When the position ended, I came to London." "A Russian family," Poirot said pleasantly. "How interesting. Many such families passed through Paris in those years. All very sad, the dispersals." He tilted his head. "You have no family yourself? In Russia or elsewhere?" The pause this time was not brief. It was the length of a decision. "I had a brother," Anna Petrovna said at last. "He is dead." "My condolences. Recently?" "No." Her voice was flat and final in a way that foreclosed the subject as completely as a closed door. "Not recently." She moved past him into the library, and Poirot listened to the quiet exchange of 2 or 3 words within before he turned and walked, with no particular appearance of haste, towards the staircase. In his room he sat in the armchair beside the inadequate fire and arranged what he knew. Edward Horbury came seeking evidence of a decades-old murder, did not find it, did not, by his account, leave his room. Displayed the distress of a man whose grievance has been resolved by someone else's hand, which is a category of human experience with its own specific texture. Anna Petrovna, 19 years in the Countess's service, a dead brother, a Paris period she did not elaborate upon. Eyes that moved through every room like a lighthouse beam, slow and thorough. Nicholas Trent. Debts. A sleeping draught. An art dealer's practiced eye for what things are worth, and who might be persuaded to sell them. Dr. Locke. Toxicological expertise. Financial dependency. A clinical composure that was either professional detachment or something considerably colder. And the Countess herself, a woman who had, by Edward Horbury's account, arranged the deaths of at least 4 people over the course of 30 years, who carried arsenic in a silver cigarette case, who received a letter that frightened her and responded to it with defiance, who was now dead. Poirot pressed the tips of his fingers together and considered the coffee cup that had contained arsenic, but not enough arsenic. He considered the sugar bowl, its spoon lying at that slight angle, the lid seated precisely in its place. He considered the handkerchief folded with such neat finality. He thought, there are two separate strands here, and they have become entangled. One strand is the Countess's history, what she was, what she did, who knew it, and how they knew it. The other strand is last night, the specific act, the specific hand, the specific moment between midnight and dawn when the matter was resolved. The first strand he was increasingly certain would illuminate the second. But there remained one thing he had not yet found: the letter. He had seen it placed beside her plate at dinner. He had seen her fold it. He had not seen it since. And in the sitting room where she had died, among all the careful inventory he had conducted that morning, there had been no letter. Someone had taken it. Before the body was found, or very shortly after. Someone who knew what it contained and did not wish Inspector Graves to read it. Poirot stood up abruptly, with the decision of a man who has been sitting long enough, and went to find the inspector. There were questions, he told himself, that only the room itself could answer, and he had not yet asked them all. Chapter 6. The Vanishing Letter. The sitting room had been sealed by Graves's sergeant, a young man of commendable thoroughness who had placed himself outside the door with the stolid permanence of load-bearing architecture. He admitted Poirot and the inspector together and resumed his post without comment. Inside, the room had acquired the slightly altered quality of a place that has been looked at by official eyes. Surfaces dusted, measurements taken, the coffee service tagged and set aside on a cloth. The Countess had been removed. Her absence was, in its way, more commanding than her presence had been. Poirot went directly to the small writing desk in the corner, which he had noted on his first visit and had not yet had occasion to examine. It was a pretty thing. French, 18th century, with brass fittings and a tooled leather surface. And it was, as he had anticipated, locked. The lock, however, was of the decorative rather than the serious variety, and the key, after a brief search, proved to be in the vase on the mantelpiece, underneath a dried arrangement of honesty and winter rose. Graves watched this process with the expression of a man who has learned not to ask how. The desk contained in its upper compartment a collection of correspondence arranged with the precision of a legal archive. Letters bundled by correspondent, secured with black ribbon, each bundle labelled in a small, exact hand. Poirot did not disturb the bundles. He noted their presence, noted the labels, several names, two of which meant nothing to him, and one of which meant a great deal, and turned his attention to the lower drawer. It was empty, not merely unoccupied, empty in the deliberate sense, the sense of a space that had been recently cleared. A faint rectangular impression in the felt lining indicated that something had rested there for a long period and been removed not long ago. Poirot pressed the corners of the felt with one careful finger. The impression was crisp at the edges. Whatever had lain there had done so for years. Whatever had removed it had done so within the last day. A journal, he said, half to himself. Or a ledger, something flat, rectangular, consistently housed. Taken last night? Or early this morning, in the interval between the death and the discovery. The window was latched from within. I confirmed that on my first visit. The door was the only entry. Whoever removed it either had a key to this room or was admitted by the Countess herself before she died. Graves absorbed this. And the letter from dinner. Also gone. Also gone. Poirot straightened and looked about the room with the slow, comprehensive attention of a man reading a page he has already partly memorized. Two things have been taken from this room. The letter, which arrived last night and disturbed the Countess greatly, and a document of some kind that had been housed in this desk for a considerable period. They may have been taken by the same person, or by different persons, at the same time or at different times. He paused. What is interesting is what has not been taken. He gestured toward the bundled correspondence. Whoever came here knew specifically what they wanted. They did not disturb the letters, did not search the upper compartment, did not touch the correspondence arranged so carefully on those shelves. They went to the lower drawer directly. That is the behavior of someone who knew this room. Not merely the house, but this room, this desk, this drawer. Graves said, Anna Petrovna. She is the most obvious candidate, Poirot agreed. 19 years in this house. She would know every surface, every hiding place, every habit of her employer. She would know what was kept in that drawer and why it mattered. He picked up the key from where he had set it on the desk's surface and turned it in his fingers. She would also know where the key was kept. I'll have her searched. By all means, though I think you will not find the letter on her person. It has had sufficient time to be destroyed or very thoroughly hidden. What interests me rather more is what was in it, what it said that produced, in a woman of the Countess's particular resilience, 4 seconds of genuine fear. He set the key down. I think, Inspector, that the letter came from someone who had discovered the Countess's history. Not rumour, certainty, documentary certainty. Someone who had, or claimed to have, proof of what she had done. Blackmail. Possibly, or a warning. The two are not always distinct. Poirot moved to the fireplace and examined it with care, though he had done so before and expected to find what he found. Clean grate, no ash, no remnant. She did not burn the letter. I am now confident it was taken, which tells us something. The letter named someone, or referenced something, that its taker could not risk the police reading. A name, perhaps, or a place, or a date that corresponds to a verifiable event. He turned to find Graves watching him with the attentive, slightly resigned expression of a man receiving a map to a country he was not aware he had entered. The bundle on the upper shelf, Poirot said, labelled in her hand, the third from the left. You will want to have those examined. I will not tell you what name is on the label because I may be mistaken, and I prefer not to direct you prematurely. But I am not mistaken. They found Trent in the picture gallery. He had not been searching it. Poirot was fairly certain of that. He had been standing before a large Dutch interior, hands clasped behind his back, in the posture of a man who has sought out a familiar landscape because it asks nothing of him. He turned when they entered with a wariness that had by now become his habitual expression. The drawings in the library, Poirot said without preliminary. You were examining them yesterday evening until 10 o'clock, you told us. A collection of Venetian school, mid-18th century. That's right. You were alone during that time. I was. And the drawings are genuine in your professional assessment. Something flickered in Trent's expression. Not guilt, Poirot thought, but the complicated discomfort of a man who has been asked a question that intersects with a private difficulty. 2 of the 3 are genuine, yes. The third is, it requires further examination. You mean it is not what it claims to be? A pause. I mean its provenance is unclear. Mr. Trent, Poirot's voice was entirely pleasant. You came here to value this collection. You have debts. I do not know their precise nature, but I observe their effect on your behavior with some clarity. A collection of this quality, with even one item of uncertain provenance, represents a problem. Not merely for the estate, but for anyone who might have advised on its acquisition, or facilitated a sale, or represented its authenticity to a buyer. Trent had gone very still. The Countess knew, Poirot said. It was not a question. She knew a great many things. The words came out with the flatness of something long compressed. It was, I gather, something of a speciality of hers. She held it over you. She had held it over me for 2 years. The drawing, it was a transaction I handled before I understood fully what I was handling. By the time I did understand, it was too late. She had the documentation. He looked at the Dutch interior rather than at either of them. She did not ask for money. That was almost worse. She asked for access to the collection, to my contacts in the market. She wanted information, not payment. She wanted to know what was moving, who was buying, what prices were being achieved. And I provided it, because the alternative was professional ruin. And last night, I took my sleeping draught at 10:15 and did not wake until the maid screamed. You may verify the dosage with the bottle if you like. I have not tampered with it. Poirot studied him. Trent's distress was real enough. So was his relief at being asked to unburden himself of it. What remained uncertain was the precise geography of that relief. Whether it was the relief of a man whose secret has been discovered and who is therefore freed from concealment, or the subtler relief of someone whose confession has, by its very completeness, directed attention away from something else. He thanked Trent and left Graves to take the formal details. In the corridor, he stood at the rain-streaked window and thought about the drawing that was not what it claimed to be, and the letter that was not where it should be, and the drawer whose contents had vanished in the night. 3 absences. And then there was the thing that was present, conspicuously, almost impertinently present, sitting on the table beside a dead woman who had never, in 2 days of close observation, been seen to smoke. The silver cigarette case. Poirot had been patient with it. He had allowed it to sit in his mind at a slight remove, returning to it periodically as one returns to a word in a foreign language, whose meaning one almost but not quite recalls. Now, standing at the rain-dark window with 3 absences arranged before him, he allowed himself to look at it directly. The case did not belong to the crime. That is to say, it had not been placed there by the killer. It had been placed there by the Countess herself. He was, at this moment, as certain of that as he was of anything. And, if that were true, then the white powder inside it was not evidence of how she had died. It was evidence of how she had lived. Poirot turned from the window with the sudden, focused energy of a man whose little grey cells have just resolved a chord they have been approaching for some time. He needed the sugar bowl. He needed Lady Margaret. And he needed most urgently a very quiet and very careful second examination of the sitting-room table. The matter, he thought, was nearly clear. Nearly. Chapter 7. The untouched sugar Lady Margaret was discovered in the morning room, engaged in the jigsaw puzzle with the dogged concentration of a woman who has decided that the arrangement of cardboard pieces represents, under the present circumstances, a morally defensible use of her attention. She looked up when Poirot entered, and set down the piece she was holding with the relief of someone given legitimate cause to stop. "Monsieur Poirot, do sit down. I find I cannot be alone with my thoughts just at present, and a puzzle is proving an insufficient substitute for company." Poirot sat. He looked at the puzzle. A country house not entirely unlike the one he was currently inhabiting, rendered in cheerful summer colours that seemed, under the circumstances, faintly reproachful. "You knew the Countess well," he said, "better perhaps than the others here." "I knew her as well as Elena permitted anyone to know her, which was not," Lady Margaret said carefully, "the same thing as knowing her well. She was the most self-contained person I have ever met. One was always aware with Elena of the conversation taking place beneath the conversation." "You were fond of her?" "I was." A pause, honest and slightly surprised. "One could be fond of her, you know, despite everything one half suspected. Perhaps because of it, in some perverse way. She was magnificent in her fashion, and she was genuinely kind to me in the small, practical ways that matter more than the large gestures people make when they wish to be noticed being kind." Poirot was quiet for a moment. Then, "Her coffee. In the evenings. She took it in her sitting room, you said. How did she take it?" Lady Margaret blinked at the transition. Black. Always black. She had very decided opinions about coffee. She said the English had never understood it, and she had long ceased to expect them to. No cream. Never. It was practically a matter of principle. And sugar. 2 lumps, always 2. Anna knew. She prepared the tray every evening. There was never any variation. Poirot said, with no change in tone, "When you say 2 lumps, from a bowl, with tongs? Or did she carry her own?" Lady Margaret opened her mouth, closed it, and looked at him with the expression of a woman who has just perceived, at a slight distance, the shape of something large and alarming. Yes, actually. She had a particular thing about sugar. She said the lumps from the bowl were always the wrong size, chipped or uneven. She carried her own in a small case. Silver, I think, or something like it. I always assumed it was merely another of her." She stopped. "Her eccentricities?" Poirot supplied gently. "Yes." Lady Margaret looked at her puzzle with unseeing eyes. "Oh," she said softly. "The sugar bowl on the tray," Poirot said, "was untouched. Its spoon had not been moved. I observed this when I first entered the room, and it has been troubling me in the manner of a small stone in a shoe. Not incapacitating, but impossible to ignore." He stood. "You have been very helpful, Lady Margaret." "Have I?" She sounded rather as though she would have preferred not to be. He returned to the sitting room. The sergeant admitted him again with the same impassive courtesy, and Poirot went directly to the table beside the chair where the Countess had spent her last hours. He did not touch the sugar bowl. He looked at it, the lid seated precisely, the spoon at its slight angle, the bowl full to within a centimetre of its rim, a bowl prepared for use and not used. Anna Petrovna had made the tray every evening. She would have known it would not be used. The bowl was theatre, he thought. Set dressing, nothing more. Then he looked at the cigarette case. It lay as it had lain since that morning. The clasp caught on one side, the lid standing open a hair's breadth, the faint trace of white powder visible along the lining. He crouched beside the table and examined it at the angle that the available light permitted, without touching. Silver, engraved with a floral pattern along the lid, old-fashioned, well-worn at the hinge, the kind of object that has been carried for years, handled daily, rubbed smooth by the particular friction of habitual use. And inside, distributed with that even deliberate care, white powder in a quantity and consistency that was not, could not be, accidental. Poirot straightened slowly. He thought about what Edward Horbury had told him. The Countess had arranged the deaths of at least 4 men at intervals spread across 3 decades, and no one had ever been able to demonstrate how. Each death had been attributed to natural causes. Each victim had been in the Countess's proximity at the relevant time and had, subsequently, ceased to be inconvenient. He thought about Lady Margaret's observation regarding the sugar, that the Countess carried her own in a small case because she disliked the irregularity of ordinary lumps. He thought about the sugar bowl full and untouched, its spoon unmoved. He thought, a woman who carries her own sugar in a small silver case for years. What is simpler than to coat a cube, just one, reserved for the appropriate occasion, with a fine layer of white powder? What is more intimate, more controllable, more invisible than a habit so established it has become beneath notice? Poirot stood very still in the middle of the room. "Mais oui," he said, and his voice in the empty room had the quality of a man confirming something he had half known for longer than he cared to admit. "She did not take her coffee last night. She took her sugar from her own supply, as she always did." The cigarette case had not been planted. It had been carried as it had been carried for years in the pocket of her gown. It was her instrument, her method, the mechanism of a system so refined by long practice that it had become, to anyone observing her, simply an old woman's fastidiousness about sugar. The white powder it contained was not evidence of how she died. It was evidence of how her victims had. He left the room and walked the length of the corridor to the small study that Graves had appropriated as an operations room, where the inspector was reading with the expression of a man digesting something disagreeable from the bundle of letters Poirot had indicated that morning. "The 3rd bundle," Poirot said without greeting. "The one I mentioned." Graves looked up. "Yes. The name on the label is Robert Horbury." He set the letters down. "Edward Horbury's father." "There are how many letters?" 7, spanning 1929 to 1931. The last one is dated 3 weeks before the date of death recorded in the inquest report I've just had telephoned through. Graves's voice was level, but there was something careful in the levelness. "They are not love letters. They are correspondence regarding what appears to be a private financial transaction. But the language is—" He paused, selecting the word with precision. "Charged. Horbury is asking questions." The Countess's replies become shorter as the sequence progresses. The final letter from Horbury includes the phrase, "I must insist on a complete accounting, or I shall be obliged to consult others." And 3 weeks later, he was dead. Of heart failure, aged 41. They looked at one another across the cluttered table. "The cigarette case," Poirot said. "I need it analysed today if it can be managed, and I need to know whether the substance inside it is the same compound as what was found in the coffee residue or a different formulation. I can telephone Lewis." "Please do so. Also—" Poirot seated himself opposite the inspector with the air of a man settling in for a precise and necessary reckoning. "I must tell you something that alters the nature of this investigation rather substantially. The Countess, I am now confident, was herself a poisoner. The case she carried was her instrument. The sugar she offered to her guests on selected occasions was not always merely sweet." Graves absorbed this in silence. "Which means," he said at last, "that whoever killed her knew it. More than that, whoever killed her used that knowledge with some precision." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "They did not bring poison into this house, Inspector. They used the poison that was already here. They turned the Countess's own method against her, which requires not only knowledge of the method, but access to the means. The cigarette case, the sugar, the habit. Someone who was very close to her," Graves said slowly, "or someone who had very recently discovered what closeness to her had always concealed." The rain had eased by late afternoon to a thin, persistent mist that clung to the garden and blurred the outlines of the dead roses. Poirot stood at the study window and felt the shape of the thing settle into its final arrangement, with the satisfaction, always complicated, never quite clean, of a mind that has reached the solution before the heart is prepared to follow. He knew who had killed Elena Vorenska. He knew the method and the motive, and the moment at which the decision had been made. He knew which detail had revealed it and which details had been designed to conceal it, and why the concealment had been at once so clever and so subtly imperfect. What remained was the gathering, the arrangement of persons and objects in a room, the careful recitation of what had been done and known and understood, the moment that Christie's fiction calls the revelation, and that Poirot himself thinks of, more plainly, as the restoration of order. He turned from the window. "Inspector," he said, "I should like to request the use of the drawing room tomorrow morning. All the guests, all the available evidence, and perhaps an hour of your patience." Graves looked at him with the resigned pragmatism of a man who knows when a thing is inevitable. "You'll tell me who beforehand?" "I will tell you tonight," Poirot said, "in private, so that you may make whatever arrangements are necessary." He reached for his hat from the chair beside him, a gesture of preparation, of resolution, of the small, orderly acts that precede the large, disorderly ones. "There is one more conversation I must have first," he said. "It will not take long, but it is, I think, the most important of all." Chapter 8. The Brother in the Mist. Anna Petrovna was in the garden. This was surprising in itself. The afternoon mist had settled into something more committed than mist, less decisive than rain, and the terrace flags were dark and slick with it. She stood at the far end near the low stone balustrade that separated the formal terrace from the slope of dead grass beyond, wearing a grey coat that made her almost invisible against the sky. She was not looking at anything in particular. She was simply standing with the quality of stillness that Poirot had observed in her from the first evening, though tonight there was something different in it. Less watchfulness, more exhaustion. He had taken his overcoat and his hat, which proved insufficient against the damp but sufficient against the cold, and he walked toward her with a deliberateness that was intended to announce his approach. She heard him on the flags and did not turn. She waited for him to arrive beside her as though she had expected this, had perhaps been expecting it since morning. "Mademoiselle Petrovna," he said. "Monsieur Poirot." A pause. The mist moved across the garden in slow currents, blurring the outline of the dead roses. "You said this morning that you were retired." "I did. And yet, here you are." "And yet," he agreed pleasantly. He stood beside her and looked out at the indistinct garden with the companionable patience of a man who has time and knows it, and is prepared to wait. After a suitable interval, he said, "Your brother, his name." She was still for a moment longer. Then she said, Dmitri. Dmitri Alexeyev Petrov. He worked for the Countess during the Paris years. It was not phrased as a question, and she did not treat it as one. He helped her leave Russia in 1920. He was 24 years old. He was strong and resourceful, and he trusted her because she had been kind to his family during the war years, when kindness from someone of her position meant something real. Her voice was entirely without expression, which in Poirot's experience indicated not the absence of feeling, but its extreme compression. He died in Paris in 1922. His heart, they said. He was how old? 26. The mist shifted. Somewhere beyond the balustrade, a bird moved in the dead grass and was still again. You came to her in 1927, Poirot said, 5 years after his death. You presented yourself as a woman seeking a position. You gave references, genuine ones, I imagine, because you're not a careless person from the Russian family in Paris, and she took you on. She did not recognize me. Dmitri and I had different fathers. We shared a mother's colouring, but nothing else. I was 4 years younger, and I had not been part of the world she moved in during the revolution. To her, I was simply another displaced Russian woman of respectable background and no particular future. A breath, barely audible. I was careful to remain simply that. For 19 years. For 19 years. Poirot turned to look at her profile, the pale, composed face. The hands in the pockets of the grey coat, which he suspected were not entirely steady. What did you find? He said quietly. Over those 19 years. What did you learn? The silence before her answer was the longest yet, and Poirot waited through it without discomfort. Everything, Anna Petrovna said at last. She was not a cautious woman, despite appearances. She was a confident one, which is different. Confident people believe their records are safe because they believe themselves beyond consequence. She kept meticulous accounts. Not a conscience, you understand, but an administrator's records. Names, dates, methods, the particular difficulties that had required resolution, and how they had been resolved. A slight compression of the lips. My brother was in those records. Entry 7. A problem of misplaced loyalty. The journal, Poirot said. That is what was in the lower drawer. A journal of sorts, more a ledger, really. She would have thought it fitting. And you took it. She turned to look at him directly for the first time since he had come out into the garden, and in her face was neither guilt nor defiance, but something considerably more weary than either. Yes, she said simply. When? Before the body was found. I woke at 6. I have always woken early. It is a habit I cannot cure. And I went to her room. The door was unlocked. I found her as you found her. I took the journal from the desk and I returned to my room. Then I waited for the maid to discover her. The letter also? The letter I had sent. She said it without drama, with the same flat precision she brought to all statements of fact. 3 weeks ago, from London, through an intermediary. I had drafted it many times over many years. When I finally sent it, I no longer expected it to produce the result it produced. I had sent it, I think, because I was tired of not having sent it. Poirot considered this with care. The letter told her that her crimes were known. That proof existed. It told her that her ledger would be delivered to the appropriate authorities unless she made a full confession of her own accord. I gave her 30 days. A pause. She had received it the evening before she died. She had 29 days remaining. And yet she died that night. Yes, Anna Petrovna said. She did. The word sat between them in the mist with considerable weight. Poirot said carefully, You did not kill her. She looked at him. No. You had 19 years of motive and 19 years of access, and considerably more intimate knowledge of her methods than anyone else in this house. And yet you did not kill her. No. Why not? The question seemed to genuinely occupy her for a moment. Because I wanted more than her. Death, she said at last. I wanted her known. I wanted the names in that ledger to mean something, so to have been written down not as her private record, but as evidence. Her death without disclosure would have been merely an ending. I wanted it to be a reckoning. She looked back at the mist. Someone else, it seems, wanted only the ending. The journal, Poirot said. Where is it now? She reached into the pocket of her grey coat and produced, without ceremony, a slim volume bound in dark red leather, its cover worn pale at the corners. She held it out to him. Poirot took it. He did not open it. He held it with both hands for a moment, with the particular gravity one brings to objects that contain the weight of other people's suffering. And then he said, "This must go to Inspector Graves." "I know. It will mean questions, possibly more than questions." "I know that also." She drew her coat more closely around her with a gesture that was not cold but conclusive, the gesture of a woman tidying away a chapter. "I have been answering to this house for 19 years, Monsieur Poirot. A few more questions will not trouble me." He left her there at the balustrade and walked back across the wet flags toward the house, the journal under his arm and the cold mist settling on his hat and the shoulders of his overcoat. At the door, he paused and looked back. She had not moved. She stood at the balustrade with her hands in her pockets, looking out at the blurred garden with an expression that he thought, at this distance and in this light, might have been relief. The particular relief of a person who has carried something very heavy for a very long time, and has, at last, set it down. Poirot went inside and found Graves in the study and placed the journal on the table before him without preamble. "The missing document," he said. "It is what I expected and worse. You will want to read it carefully before tomorrow morning." Graves looked at the dark red cover. Anna Petrovna? She took it to preserve it, not to destroy it. She has been in this house for 19 years, gathering precisely this evidence. She is not your murderer, Inspector. She is, in a very particular sense, your chief witness. He sat down and told Graves everything. The brother, the letter, the long, patient accumulation of a wrong that had never been answered. Graves listened without interrupting, which was, Poirot felt, a mark in his favour. When it was done, the inspector sat for a moment in the manner of a man reorganizing a map. "Then the question remains," Graves said. "Who did?" "The question," Poirot said, "does not remain. I have known the answer since this afternoon. What remains is the demonstration, the laying out of the argument in a form that is not merely correct, but comprehensible. That is, for tomorrow." He stood and straightened his coat with the habitual small gesture of a man restoring his own order. "Tonight," he said, "I will tell you the name. And then I think, Inspector, we will both sleep rather better than we did last night." He crossed to the window and looked out at the dark garden where the mist had thickened now to something very close to rain, and where a grey coat was no longer visible against the sky. Anna Petrovna had gone in. Good, Poirot thought. It was too cold for a woman who had, for one evening at least, finished her long work and deserved the warmth of an ordinary room. Chapter 9. The Drawing Room Reckoning. The drawing room at Blackthorn House had been designed for occasions of some formality. Its proportions were generous, its fireplace imposing, its tall windows arranged to flatter the occupants with good light at the correct hours. It had hosted, Poirot imagined, a considerable number of significant conversations over the years. None, he suspected, quite like this one. He had asked for the chairs to be arranged in a loose semicircle before the fireplace, a request that the remaining footman had fulfilled, with the slightly dazed compliance of a household staff that has ceased, in the last 24 hours, to have any reliable sense of what might be required of it next. A fire burned with appropriate gravity. The morning light came through the tall windows pale and clear, the mist of the previous evening having resolved overnight into a cold, cleansed brightness. They assembled at 10 o'clock. Lady Margaret sat nearest the fire, her hands folded in her lap with the determined composure of a woman who has decided to be equal to whatever the morning produces. Nicholas Trent chose the chair at the farthest remove from the others, which Poirot noted without comment. Dr. Locke stood for a moment before sitting, as though calculating the significance of each available position, and settled finally on a chair that placed him equidistant from everyone, which was perhaps its own kind of statement. Anna Petrovna took the straight-backed chair she had occupied from the first evening, near the audiobook door, and folded her hands with an expression of settled patience. Edward Horbury was last. He came in with his coat still on, as though he had not entirely decided whether to stay, and sat with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the floor. He looked, Poirot thought, like a man who has slept badly and woken to the knowledge that sleep was the least of his difficulties. Inspector Graves stood near the door. His sergeant was outside it. Poirot took his position before the fireplace. He did not rush. He looked briefly at each face in the room with the comprehensive, unhurried attention of a man verifying that the figures in an account are all present before beginning to read it. Then he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, what I'm about to tell you is not, in the first instance, a story about murder. It is a story about a system. The murder is the system's final consequence. The point at which it turned back upon itself with the neat irony that attends, sooner or later, most systems built upon the suffering of others." He paused. No one spoke. The fire settled with a sound like a quietly drawn breath. Elena Varenska was a woman of exceptional intelligence and, I'm obliged to say, exceptional ruthlessness. She survived events that destroyed most of her class and contemporaries, and she survived them not by fortune alone, but by method. She was, from at least 1920, and quite possibly earlier, a poisoner. Deliberate, careful, and systematic. The ledger which Inspector Graves now holds in evidence records 7 such acts over a period of approximately 30 years. 7 people whose inconvenience she resolved with arsenic, administered in small quantities, coated on sugar which she carried in a silver case, and offered on selected occasions with the apparent eccentricity of a woman who simply preferred her own supply. Lady Margaret made a small sound that was not quite a word. Trent had gone very still by the far window. She was not caught, Poirot continued. Because the method was patient, the victims were distributed across years and countries, and because a charming woman of good family who offers sugar from her own case is not, to the casual observer, offering anything more sinister than an idiosyncrasy. He turned slightly. The coffee cup in her sitting room contained traces of arsenic, but not enough to kill. That arsenic came from the case during a spillage or a previous preparation. It was residual, not intentional. The fatal dose came from somewhere else, from the sugar she took herself that final night. Her own, Locke said. His voice was precise, controlled, and entirely unsurprised. She poisoned herself. She did not poison herself, Poirot said. Someone poisoned her sugar. Someone who had found the case, understood its purpose, and introduced into it a quantity of arsenic sufficient to ensure that the next sugar cube she took from it would be her last. He let this settle. The question of who had access to the case is, on the surface, a wide one. It was carried on her person or kept in her sitting room. Anna Petrovna prepared her evening tray and entered the sitting room regularly. Dr. Locke attended her medically and moved through the private rooms of the house without restriction. Mr. Trent was given access to the ground floor galleries, but not, he would have us believe, to the Countess's private quarters. Trent stirred. "I told you. You told me a sleeping draught and a closed door." Poirot's voice was not unkind. "And I believe you, Mr. Trent. Your difficulty is financial, not homicidal, and the Countess's death removes the leverage she held over you without providing any corresponding benefit. You did not kill her. You had neither the precise knowledge nor, I think, the particular quality of feeling that this murder required." Trent subsided. "Dr. Locke." Poirot turned to face him directly. "You had knowledge. You had access. You had, if the financial records are accurate, a motive of pressing practical urgency. The facts arranged themselves around you with what I can only describe as suspicious enthusiasm." A slight pause. "Too suspicious, as I remarked to Inspector Graves at the outset. An intelligent man does not commit a murder that advertises his expertise. And you are, Dr. Locke, an intelligent man." Locke met his gaze steadily. "Then I am exonerated by my own competence." "You are exonerated by the psychology. A guilty man in your position produces the appearance of innocence. An innocent man in your position has no need to produce anything at all. And yet the evidence against him accumulates regardless, because evidence follows opportunity, and opportunity is a function of proximity. You were proximate. You were not the killer." The room had taken on a particular quality of stillness. Not the restless, fidgeting stillness of people waiting for something unpleasant, but the deeper, held stillness of people who have understood that the unpleasant thing is very close now. Poirot turned to Edward Horbury. Edward had not looked up from the floor. He had not, as far as Poirot could observe, moved at all since the recital began. He sat with his forearms on his knees and his eyes fixed on the carpet between his feet, and there was about him the quality of a man who has been walking toward a particular moment for a very long time, and has arrived at it and does not intend to pretend otherwise. "Mr. Horbury," Poirot said quietly. Edward looked up. "You told me," Poirot said, "that you lay awake for 2 hours on the night of the Countess's death, considering whether to act, and that you decided finally not to. That you had tired of it, that you were not your father." "Yes," Edward said. His voice was level and entirely without evasion. "That was the truth, and it was not the truth." Poirot's voice was not harsh. It was, if anything, gentler than it had been at any point in the preceding recital. "You lay awake for 2 hours, and then you rose." A silence. "You did not search her desk. You had no need of the journal. You had come seeking evidence, but you found something more direct. When you went to the sitting room, you found the cigarette case, not on her person, on the table beside the coffee tray, where she had set it while she prepared for the night. You opened it, you saw the powder, and you understood at once what it was. and what it was for. Edward said nothing. He had returned his gaze to the carpet. "You had no arsenic of your own," Poirot continued. "You had no plan, no preparation, no premeditated design. What you had was a moment, and a man's lifetime of grief, and a poisoner's own instrument lying open before you. You took a small quantity of the powder from the lining, enough to coat a single cube from the supply she kept in the case itself. And you replaced it. And then you left the room. And then you went back to bed. The fire, the pale winter light, Lady Margaret's hands no longer, folded, pressed flat against her knees. She deserved it. The words came from Edward Horbury with the flat, exhausted simplicity of a thing said, not for the room's benefit, but because the pressure of not saying it had finally become greater than the pressure of saying it. She murdered my father. She murdered 6 other people at least, and she lived in this house with her garnets and her Venetian drawings and her very particular opinions about coffee for 30 years, without consequence. I did not plan it. I did not bring anything into this house. I simply returned to her by the most direct route available what she had been giving to others for decades. He looked up at Poirot then, and his face had the stripped, exhausted quality of a man who has put down a weight and does not yet know what his arms feel like without it. "I am not sorry," he said. "I wish I could tell you I was. I think it would be easier for everyone if I were." Poirot looked at him for a long moment. "I know," he said simply. He stepped back. "Inspector Graves," he said. Graves moved forward from the door, and the sergeant came in from the corridor, and the drawing-room of Blackthorn House arranged itself, as drawing-rooms in these circumstances do, around the necessary business of what comes next. Lady Margaret made a sound that was grief, genuine and unguarded. Nicholas Trent looked at the floor. Dr. Locke looked at nothing. Anna Petrovna looked at Edward Horbury with an expression that contained, Poirot thought, neither condemnation nor approval, but the complex, unwilling recognition of one person who has lived inside an old wrong for a very long time, toward another who has chosen to resolve it by the most irreversible means available. Edward Horbury stood, straightened his coat with the automatic tidiness of a man performing a habitual gesture for the last time in a particular context, and went with the sergeant without being asked. At the door he paused and looked back, not at the room in general, but at Poirot specifically. "How did you know it was me?" he said. "And not her?" A slight inclination of the head toward Anna Petrovna. "Because," Poirot said, "she wanted justice. And justice, Mr. Horbury, requires a witness. You wanted something else, something quieter and more personal. A man who wants justice does not act alone in the dark. A man who wants the thing to simply be over does." Edward considered this for a moment. Then he nodded once and went out. Chapter 10. The symmetry returns. The cars came for them at different times, which Poirot felt was appropriate. Graves's sergeant drove Edward Horbury to Lewes shortly before noon. Lady Margaret, who had been sitting in the morning room with her hands in her lap and the jigsaw puzzle ignored beside her, watched the car pass the window with an expression that Poirot found, if he was honest with himself, the most affecting thing he had witnessed in the entire affair. It was not the grief of someone losing a beloved person. It was the more complicated grief of someone losing their reliable sense of what the people around them are capable of, which is, in its way, the more disorienting loss. She turned from the window when the car had gone. "He really did it," she said. Not to Poirot in particular, to the room or to herself, or to the general proposition that the world persists in producing surprises of a kind one would not have chosen. "He really did," Poirot said gently. "I brought him here." A pause waited with the particular self-reproach of a woman who takes responsibility for things that are not, in any rational accounting, her responsibility. "If I had not brought him here—" "If you had not brought him here, he might have found another occasion, or he might not. We cannot follow the other paths." Poirot seated himself opposite her with the unhurried calm of a man who considers the next 10 minutes as important as any that preceded them. "What I can tell you, Lady Margaret, is this. Edward Horbury was not a man who sought to kill. He was a man who found himself, in one unpremeditated moment, holding the means to resolve a wrong that had been done to his family, and he used it. Whether the law will view that with some leniency, I cannot say with certainty. But I think it may." Lady Margaret looked at him. "Because of what she was. Because of what she was, and because of what the ledger contains, and because a jury, when presented with the systematic history of Elena Varenska's activities over 30 years, will be asked to weigh one act of impulsive retribution against 7 acts of calculated, cold-blooded murder." He paused. The scales are not level. They were never level. She was quiet for a moment. Then, with the resilient practicality that Poirot had always considered her most admirable quality, "I shall engage the best solicitor I can find, whatever it costs." "That," Poirot said, "is exactly the right response." Dr. Locke departed in the early afternoon with his bag and a brief, formal handshake for Graves, and a rather longer look at Poirot. "I am grateful," he said, with the constrained dignity of a man who finds gratitude nearly as uncomfortable as its absence, "for the clarity of your reasoning." "The facts," Poirot said, "were not your enemy, Docteur, only their arrangement." He hesitated, then added, because it was true and because the man deserved to hear it, "You behaved throughout with considerable professional honour. The examination, the disclosure, the transparency regarding your expertise, these were the actions of an honest man in a difficult position. I hope the inquest will reflect that." Locke nodded once, briefly, and went. His relief was visible in the set of his shoulders as he crossed the gravel, and Poirot did not begrudge it him. Nicholas Trent left without ceremony, having spent the morning in a state of barely suppressed urgency that Poirot attributed correctly to the professional calculations being performed behind his pleasant face. The fraudulent drawing remained a matter for the estate's executors, and what that would mean for Trent's reputation in the market was a question that would resolve itself in due course, without Poirot's assistance. He had enough to attend to. Anna Petrovna came to find Poirot in the late afternoon. She knocked at the door of the small sitting room where he had established himself with his thoughts and a last cup of tisane, and entered with the unhurried self-possession of a woman accustomed to entering rooms on her own terms. She sat without being asked, and looked at him with those steady grey eyes that had been watching everything in Blackthorn House for 19 years, with such patient, comprehensive attention. "The ledger," she said. "Graves tells me it will be used in the inquest proceedings, that the names will be formally recorded. It will, and they will. The families of those named in it will be contacted where they can be found. It's unlikely, after so many years, that criminal proceedings can be brought against an estate rather than a person. But the record will exist. It will be official. It will be known." She absorbed this in silence. "Dmitri," she said. "Entry 7? It will be in the record." Something moved across her face. Not relief precisely, not the uncomplicated release of a burden long carried, but something more complex and more honest. The recognition, perhaps, that the resolution of a very old wrong does not restore what was lost. It merely stops the loss from being the only thing. "What will you do now?" Poirot asked. "You have been in this house for 19 years. You have done what you came to do. The house will be sold, I imagine, and the household dispersed." "I have some savings." The words were entirely practical, offered without self-pity. "A sister in Edinburgh who has asked me to come for 30 years. I think I will finally go." "Edinburgh," Poirot repeated, with the carefully neutral tone of a man who considers the Scottish climate a form of moral severity he has not personally earned. "I hope it suits you." For the first time in his acquaintance with Anna Petrovna, she smiled. It was a small smile, undemonstrative, but it was entirely genuine, and it altered her face considerably. "I think it will," she said. She stood, extended her hand with the formal directness of someone who has not often had occasion to offer it, and Poirot shook it. "You are a good man," she said. "In your fashion." "In my fashion," Poirot agreed. "It is perhaps not everyone's fashion, but it is the only one available to me." She left, and the room was quiet, and Poirot finished his tisane and looked out at the garden in the failing afternoon light. The roses were quite dead now. Even the last copper petals had gone, taken by last night's wet wind, and what remained were the skeletal canes, stripped to their essential architecture, thorned dark, and in their own way rather elegant. The gravel drive curved towards the portico with its weathered columns, and the ivy on the eastern wall had darkened further in the damp, and the house stood in the last of the light, with the patient, slightly melancholy dignity of a place that has seen too much to be easily surprised by any of it. It was, Poirot thought, not an ugly house. Under different stewardship, with the gardens restored and the hedges cut to an even height, it might even be a pleasant one. He drove back to London the following morning. George had lit the fire in the sitting room of the flat in anticipation of his return, which was the kind of small, precise consideration that Poirot valued in his valet above qualities that other men might have ranked more highly. The room was warm. The ornaments on the mantelpiece were exactly as he had left them. The correspondence was arranged in a neat stack beside his chair. He set down his hat and his overcoat and stood for a moment in the centre of the room, taking inventory of it in the way that one takes inventory of the familiar after a period of its absence, confirming that the things one values have remained where they were left. On the mantelpiece stood two small porcelain figures that he had acquired some years ago and which he continued to find pleasing. He looked at them. They were, as he had left them, perfectly aligned. He straightened one by perhaps 2 degrees. Then he considered and straightened it back. He sat in his armchair and picked up the first letter from the stack and did not read it immediately, because his mind was still arranged around the business of Blackthorn House and required a little time to rearrange itself around the ordinary business of the world. This was always the way after a case. The grey cells, having been roused to their full and considerable activity, do not subside at once. They continue to turn the matter over, examining it from new angles, testing the conclusions, finding them sound, setting them down. He thought about Edward Horbury, who had gone to Sussex to find evidence and had instead found an opportunity and had taken it without premeditation in a moment that had resolved 30 years of a family's grief in a single, irreversible act. who had walked back to his room afterward and lain in the dark until morning. Poirot had heard through Graves that Edward had said very little to the solicitor and had answered the formal questions at the station with the composed, cooperative brevity of a man who has no interest in constructing a defence he does not believe in. The solicitor Lady Margaret had engaged was a formidable one. The ledger's contents, now formally entered into the record, would say what they said. The law would do what the law does, which is not always precisely what justice would do, but which is, on balance, preferable to the alternative. He thought about Anna Petrovna on a train to Edinburgh. 19 years of patience rewarded not by the reckoning she had constructed so carefully, but by something less formal and more final. He was not certain she had received what she deserved. He was not certain, in a case of this particular moral complexity, that deserving was the operative category. He thought about Elena Vorenska, who had been charming and magnificent and ruthless in equal measure, and who had carried her instrument with her for 30 years, with the unhurried confidence of a woman who did not anticipate that the world would find a way to use it against her. He thought, the world usually does, eventually. It is slow, and it is imprecise, and it does not always reach the right conclusion by the right means. But it is, in its plodding, asymmetrical fashion, more persistent than even the most patient poisoner. George appeared at the door. "Will you take dinner at home this evening, sir?" "Yes," Poirot said. "Something simple, George, and orderly. Nothing that requires assembly at the table." "Very good, sir." When George had gone, Poirot looked once more at the two porcelain figures on the mantelpiece, standing in their precise alignment in the warm light of the London flat, and felt the particular, qualified satisfaction of a man who has restored a small portion of the world's order at the cost of being reminded, once again, how much disorder the world contains. "The symmetry returns," he murmured, "but the sadness remains." He opened the first letter. Outside in the autumn street, London conducted its business with its customary cheerful indifference to the sorrows of Sussex, and the clocks ticked, and the world moved forward in its imperfect fashion, as it always has, and as Hercule Poirot had long since made his peace with its always doing.